Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs. So today, in working through this, call it like a transitional phase of the show, where Chris and I have agreed to reduce the number of episodes we are recording together, just because of it's just scheduling and the whole hemisphere problem has proved to be too much for recording weekly for us. So we are going to drop down. He and I are going to drop down to probably every other week or so as our schedules allow. So that leaves me with a combination of solo episodes, as I've done a few lately, and also some ones where I bring on some interesting guests. And today is the first of those. So I have with me today a new friend, actually a longtime listener of the show. And now we had traded texts. We had discussed all kinds of things on Discord. And then we finally actually met, quote unquote, in person, that being via video conferencing. But I have a gentleman by the name of Steve Zaccardi on today to talk about an adventure that he wrote for Achtung, Cthulhu, which is available on drive-thru through the 2D20 World Builders program. And I would like to talk about this adventure because, frankly, I don't think Achtung, Cthulhu in general gets enough love or attention. But I'd also like to talk with him about adventure design, and I'll circle back to why I want to do that. But before I keep rattling on, Steve, thanks so much for coming on. Thank you for complimenting on me on my fine Iron Maiden shirt. I'm sure you could find one on the internet. I'm sure it'd be accommodating. But thank you for giving us some of your time today and be willing to come on and talk about your work.
Hey, Jeremy, thank you for having me. This is exciting, and I hope we can give some interesting pointers and some background behind Rendezvous at Rouen.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and dive right into that. So for those of you who, I'm sure a lot of people listening are listening because the original foundation of this show was 2D20. And as Steve, you pointed out, it's like we were for the longest time, and I kind of feel like we're still that. There are basically no 2D20 focused pods out there or shows out there. There's basically nothing. And we used to talk a lot about 2D20 games, especially Achtung, Cthulhu, for which I've done some writing, and you have as well. But for those of you who aren't aware, Achtung, Cthulhu is part of the 2D20 World Builders license through Modiphius, which allows people to write for certain properties that Modiphius has. None of the licensed IPs like Star Trek or Dune, but Achtung, Cthulhu is their own property. So you can write adventures for them, and you did write an adventure for them. And so I'd like to, let's go through that. Let's talk about what the adventure is, where it fits into the context of other adventures that are available. So for people who are interested, what's this all about? And then we could talk about where they can find it.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you how it started. I was working on an Achtung, Cthulhu adventure after I had finished up writing the Dune adventure, Shaitan's Bargain. I finished that. And I wanted to do something for Achtung, Cthulhu, particularly because it's World Builders, and it was the first license available for World Builders. I think they've got Cohorts Cthulhu now that you'll be able to write for. So I wanted to try that out, and I started writing a very large sandbox adventure, and it was taking a little bit of time. But along comes I think it was Roll20 and Drive-Thru RPG put out a call for adventures, and it was in terms of the next adventure. That's what they called it. And the idea was anyone out there that was writing for the things like World Builders or other places where it's public domain and supported by the publishers could put out an adventure that follows on any startup adventure or any quick start or anything of that nature. And I said, oh, this is a great thing. I could do something small, short, because these things are supposed to be relatively short. Until you get into them, then it's always a different story, which we'll get into. But I said, let me just jump into that. So that's where I put aside the big thing I was working on. And I said, let me go and see if I can do it. I wanted to challenge myself a little bit, Jeremy. Like, can I do a sprint where I do nothing else, completely focused on this one adventure and get it done by their deadline? Because they had a deadline. Now, mind you, the only thing about the deadline was just the fact that they would do some advertisement for you. They'd put it up in the banner on Drive Through RPG as the next adventure and stuff. And I wanted to see if I could make it. So that was how the adventure started. That's where I got the idea of let me write something for this, and it was a follow-on for Achtung Cthulhu. For those folks who would know from the quick start, a quick trip to France. That was the initial adventure that I developed Rendezvous at Rouen from.
So this is interesting, actually. I must have missed that whole thing from Drive Through, or maybe I just saw it in an email and too busy, click, delete it. That's actually a really interesting challenge because, I mean, you know how it is with writing. It is actually much easier once you start writing to keep writing beyond what you should than to be concise and stick a fork in it.
Yep.
For those of you who aren't familiar, A Quick Trip to France is set in June 1940. It's as France is finally in the process of surrendering to the Nazis, and Black Sun is setting up operations in some small town in northern France, and the agents get called in at the last second to deal with horrible Black Sun stuff. I'll put a link to the download directly from Modifius' site. And the lovely thing about this quick start is that it has the basic rules, it has characters, it has all the baddies that you need to run the thing, and then it has this adventure which ends up, if you scrape the paint just a little bit, you realize that, well, the agents are all left in France after the end of this thing. It's late June 1940. The Nazis have overrun the country, and you're standing there going, what am I going to do? Now, I ran that for my party years ago, and then I just assumed we just, end scene, you make your way back to England. I like the idea of Rendezvous at Rouen in that it provides the immediate follow-on, but then it also provides the means of getting off the continent. So why don't you give us a quick summary without spoilers of the adventure and how it proceeds.
Sure. Well, first thing I said was like, all right, let me see refresh my memory on Quick Trip to France. So I read through it and I saw that there was a mention of Rouen, a town in Normandy, that was a real town. Everyone knows where Rouen exists, as opposed to Saint-Sulak, which is a fictional town. And it mentioned the Rouen in it. I was like, okay, that's a perfect kind of jump point. Like, that's the place the folks can go to get out of the continent. Because, like you said, the original Avenger, A Quick Trip to France, just kind of left you at the end. Once you took care of the baddies in whatever way in the center of Saint-Sulak, you just assumed that you got out of there. But I said, that's a great starting point. So what I did was there, just to give you an overall summary of the adventure, is I did some research on Rouen real quick. I said, let me just read what's there. What is interesting? What could make an interesting story? And I saw that there is a cathedral of Rouen, very famous cathedral, and it has some interesting elements to it. First thing I saw as an interesting element was Richard the Lionheart apparently is, partly buried there. It's actually, I guess, just his heart that's buried there. You know how these things are, right? And in the medieval France, right, you get bits and pieces of people all over the place. I said, that's interesting. Maybe I could do something with that.
That sounds very Mythos, Achtung Cthulhu-ish. That's a great on-ramp.
Could you see it? It's like, okay, wait a minute. You got this cathedral. You got bits and pieces of some historical figure. And one thing I like to do is when I approach this stuff is put some history into it. I'm a big history buff. I love World War II. All the heroics that occurred there and the defeating of evil and everything. And I just thought that Achtung Cthulhu was a great way to present that in a fun manner, right, as opposed to a pure historical manner. So I took that and just kind of ran with it. And I wrote on my phone, I just brought up notes and I wrote, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I looked at Quick Trip to France. They had 4 scenes. Really quick, 1, 2, 3, 4. It was certainly a linear design. I said, I'm going to stick with that, stick with their framework, and I'm going to do 4 scenes. So I wrote it down. I said, sneaking into the city, contact with an underground. Someone's going to get you out of there. Everyone always loves French resistance. Get to the cathedral, go to the crypt, Then what are you going to do? And I said, well, let me invent something. And I just threw in catacombs. I mean, this is France, right, Jeremy? It's like the catacombs of Paris. It's like spooky, very mythos-like. So I
And
threw in some catacombs.
it's an easy thing to throw in that there are enough. The lovely thing about that is that there are enough real pictures, maps, and so on and so forth that people can turn to that and immediately they have a sense of it without you having to do all this work of explaining what these things look like. So I liked that. And everybody loves You don't like catacombs. Why are you even gaming?
What are you doing, right? Especially in France, trolling around in cathedrals and stuff. Now, I don't believe there's any catacombs underneath Rouen Cathedral, but that's fine, right? This is what we're doing. Is we're making stuff up here for the joy of it and the joy of the hobby. So once you get through the catacombs, and like you mentioned right there, and I'll get to it maybe a little later, is how do you abstract something really complex like that and you put it into an adventure where you give the game master and the players the ability to feel what they're doing, but don't have to map everything out. And then the final scene was, you got to have a climactic final boss battle, and I wanted to create a mythos creature. I had never done one for Achtung Cthulhu. I wanted to throw one in there. So there's a final, big boss battle at the end of the adventure. And if you survive, your agents all make it to the coast of England.
Okay, so then this is great because if you've not played Achtung Cthulhu, okay, it's as an aside, I think it's a great version of the 2D20 rules. There's nothing really abstract about it. It's really straightforward. I think it's not too crunchy. It's not too narrative. And because it's the Second World War and it's mid 20th century action, like grabbing on to what it's supposed to look like, what it's supposed to feel like, how it's supposed to proceed is very easy. So if you're interested in the system, this is a great way to get familiar with its core. And who doesn't like a World War II quasi, supernatural Indiana Jones, Guns of Navarone, that kind of vibe. Who doesn't love that? And so Quick Trip to France, I've run it a number of times and it's always gone over well. But I like this. I like that this then provides your an immediate follow on. Quick Trip to France can be run in like 2 sessions. How long do you anticipate this one? And this one kind of looked to me like a roughly the same.
I think with experienced folks, it could be. It might take a little longer for beginners. I threw in, from a rule set perspective, let's touch on that for a minute. These introductory modules certainly want to give you a taste of what the core mechanic is and all that stuff. And I looked at what Quick Trip to France provided, and I wanted to go a little bit beyond that. So give the buyers of this module, this adventure, something else to add in, and maybe even make a determination of whether they want to take on some more 2D20 stuff. So I threw in, from a rules perspective, I got vehicles in here, very light on vehicles, and I put one of the most, I guess, at times can be a little hard for folks to grasp is the extended test. And I wanted to give an example of an extended test in here. And the extended test is the catacombs. Won't go into all the details there, but I made the trip through the catacombs to get to the exit, if you will, the final boss battle, and then get out of France, an extended test. And I'll give credit to Nathan Dowdle. Nathan had made a comment on the Discord about the use of extended tests, and he gave a brief outline of something. He said, hey, you could use this as a chase scene. And it was more of a tug of war, if you will. And I was like, well, let me grab onto that and see if I can put something like that mechanic in. So that'll be a chase through the catacombs, and you're being pursued by Black Sun forces. And that was something that I thought I could provide, and folks could get their first taste of what an extended test was and give it in a sense of something exciting like that extended test through the catacombs, a chase. But I'll tell you what happened, Jeremy. So I was writing this up and I was going like, wow, this is still confusing. Okay, it's not a difficult mechanic to grasp once you understand the ins and outs of it. I think the original design is great for it. Loved it in Star Trek Adventures. Love it everywhere in 2D20. But I was like, I need something more for the players. So I went out, and this caused me to get delayed. But I decided to write a test example. So in the appendices, I put a 2-page example of an extended test use in regards to, or in relation to this this chase scene. And I wrote it all up, and I put the GM, and it's kind of like harkening back to the old days when you had player one, player two, player three.
Yeah,
And
I'm just actually rereading the Star Wars D6 core book from West End Games, and there's a whole section of that. Yeah, it explains it. And I love the fact that you did this, but also you included the like a score sheet, for so that it makes so a GM can print this thing out and make sense of it while they are running the thing. I appreciate that. But sorry, go on.
No, that's it. So I was writing that appendix. I was like, gosh, you need something visible here, something visual the GM can look at. This is the first time, especially if someone, I price this very reasonably because I want folks to have it in their hands. The first time they're running this and they got an extended test. So I drew it up. I spent extra time doing that. I'll tell you, I didn't make the deadline. I finished this I think their deadline was October 1st, I think it was, and I ended up being November 5th when I uploaded it to Drive-Thru RPG. So I was about a month behind with this extra stuff I was doing. And then I threw in a couple extra maps I wasn't going to do. But it's that was one of my big goals here, was to get a decent design for an extended test out there and then do that additional stuff. Now, I'm familiar with the restrictions that Modiphius puts on their freelancers. When I wrote Shaitan's Bargain for Dune, there was a very strict word count that I had to meet. Yeah. Needless to say, my first draft was over by 1,500 words. Yeah. I had to go in and chop out a lot. I know you've run into the same thing because you've written for them too. What was wonderful about world builders, and I'll tell you, for those folks who follow you on the podcast and what have you, and they want to give it a try, what a wonderful thing about world builders is you can do everything you want. Yep. You don't have to cut it out. You can go ahead and you put your extra stuff in. If you think it's going to be reasonable for the players or valuable for the GM, you can write it up and put it in there, and no one's going to give you, no editor's going to come back and say, no, you got to cut out 1,500 words and we can't put extra maps in and what have you. It's very liberating.
Yeah, I had, when I wrote the final adventure that's in the D-Day book, the Unleash the Hellish Hordes, I was limited to 10,000 words. And that's hard. Yeah. That's really hard. And then the Operation Talisman, which is the Achtung Cthulhu module that they bought from me a few years ago. I forget what the word limit was, but there was a word limit there as well. And you're right, having your own thing and being able to say, well, I'm the limit, which then of course creates other problems, like, you don't have to be, but you ought to be concise. And it's easy to just keep writing. Well, let me ask you this, because like I said, I like the adventure. I think the fact that it's $2. It's 32 pages. It's $2. If you download the free quick start and you like it, you have the rules and you have the characters, and then you spend a whopping $2 on top of that. You have another couple of sessions with those characters, but with an expansion of the rules. And I agree with you that there are some dimensions or aspects of the 2D20 system that are, once you get them, I think they are self-evident truths. Like, once you get them, they totally make sense. But getting them and then understanding how to play them well at the table is something else. And the extended tasks play a role in spellcasting. So it's not like the extended task is something that, like, well, you might use it, you might not. It's like, no, if you have a spell you're going to use it. And if you're running the game, you're going to use it as GM, because you're going to have enemies that are going to cast spells, use magic at some point. So I like the fact that you took the time to explain that. How did you go about, because this is where I want to pick your mind here. I don't want to pick your brain, because that's gross. I want to pick your mind about, like,
hey, peace of mind.
Yeah. How did you go about, you talked about, you made it essentially, this you followed the structure of A Quick Trip to France. Aside from that, how did you approach this? Because I have actually found, like, I'm the forever GM, and I enjoy that. Actually, Chris and I agree on this. We would rather run than play, because there's a level of interest and engagement. Like, as GM, you're always engaged because you're running the world, you're running the weather, you're running all the NPCs. I actually find running my character only as a player kind of boring and limiting. So I enjoy writing adventures for my group. I have actually discovered in the several adventures that I have now written on my own and have been purchased from me, writing adventures for a GM I don't know and players I'll never meet is, for me, really, really difficult. It is much harder than, and especially with a word count limit. So how did you go about, aside from just following a structure, what was your kind of what was your perspective? How did you go about developing this and thinking, I'm writing this for a GM I don't know and players I'll never meet?
Yeah, this is one of the tricky things getting into it. It can be off-putting for some folks, aspiring designers, writers out there. It can be off-putting for them, but I think if you're going into a new mission and adventure, and I love writing adventures because it's got rules in it. It's got art. It has and I mean, when I say art, the craft of writing, the craft of creating a narrative. You bring all this into it, and if you're writing it for yourself, and it's something that's interesting to you as a GM, it's going to be interesting to others. There's no doubt it's going to be interesting to others. Not everyone's going to like it. Certainly, you can't.
No matter what you write, no matter what anyone writes, there's going to be someone out there who just doesn't dig it. Yeah,
you can't. Yeah, they're not going to dig it, right? And that's fine. Everyone's got their thing that they love. But when I approached this, and I looked at that just overview, that outline that I mentioned to you at the beginning there, I said, is this interesting? Like, is it an interesting draw from scene to scene? Now, this is a linear adventure. It's not a sandbox. Sandbox adventures can become very complex. They could suffer from overwriting because you are trying to put every conceivable branch or what the players may do in there for the GM, and you can overdo it.
I've seen this where there are, I think, and I don't say this as a dig. I say this as a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
That there are some RPG writers who are frustrated authors. And instead of writing a novel, they write a setting. Or they write an adventure that is instead like their vision for this world or this place or these characters. And it becomes less of a, here are some bits and pieces and here's a plot. You're going to do this. And I don't know what you're going to do with it. And it turns into something it's too dense. There's too much. Yeah. And then either you're going to have someone who reads it and go, this is too much, and they're going to tear it apart and use bits and pieces of it, and it's not going to be what you intended, or they're just going to say, this is too much, or they're going to be like that 1% of people who are like, I embrace your vision completely, and that's, yeah.
So you said frustrated writers. You got to approach this with some of the rules of writing in mind, though. For example, the show don't tell. You want to create a visualization for the game masters. The game master is the first person to read this. You're selling these principally to game masters, and you want to give them the elements of writing, the narrative, the characters. You want to have some NPCs that are very meaningful, that have a consistency and a rationale for being, and you want to give them just enough of the background where you don't become a bloated thing like you were just mentioning, right? That like, I'm going to create my new setting and all of this, and here's everything written out. Great novelists don't do that. They'll give you just enough so your own mind can fill in all those blanks. And one thing I did while I was, writing this, I said, let me do the check. Is this exciting? Do I like to read this? Can I get out of my head and say, I'm going to read this for the first time? Do I want to see what happens in the next scene? And if I can say yes to all those things, I'm like, okay, I know I'm hitting it then. I'm hitting the meaningfulness of the characters. The background can be filled in. There's enough to hang it together, but not enough to overwhelm and to take the fun out of the GM, moving things around. So, for example, how do you kind of build that? So that when I put the maps together, I made, difficult to take a city like Rouen and then created a game map out of it. Right? I simplified it all. I put some city streets in there that I totally made up, except for one of the principal streets that the agents have to get to in order to meet the French resistance, their contact, if you will, within the city. But I put some of the major aspects of the city in there, like where the gendarme was within Rouen, which the Germans, when they occupied the city right after the fall of France, that was the first place they set up headquarters, right? Beside, the bishop's palace next to the Rouen Cathedral. I put the hospital there. There's nothing in the adventure that happens in the hospital, but it's a major thing. So that way, if the game master wants to go in there, let's say, she knows their players really well. Oh, my players they're going to want to go through the town and do different things. And I actually want to create a little side scene, maybe at the gendarme, or the hotel. I want to create a side scene there. Then there's enough material for them to just spark. And then they could put something in there. They can put their own scene if they want to, because their players would love it.
But you're not trying to load it down with all of these things. Yeah, because I think one of the hard things, one of the hard balance points, and I don't think it's a point, it's more like a zone that I keep trying to find when I write these things, is how much is too much, how much is too little. Because the last thing I would want is someone to, pony up a couple dollars and they get this and they're like, the heck is this? Like, there's nothing here. It basically says, do what you want. And that's, and I've bought things like that before, and it's frustrating. Like, you have all these bits and bobs, but there is no coherent connective tissue. But on the other hand, if it's this tightly wound web and there's all these, like, I can't wrap my head around it. But so I like that, the idea for an adventure like this, you have a clear, there is a plot, there is a path, and yet you put some major landmarks, figuratively or literally in this case, alongside that. So if a GM feels like doing something more, they're able to do that.
Exactly. I mean, that's it. And I like the word you used, connective tissue. It is. It's truly like that. This is a living entity. And it's going to evolve. It's going to change. As soon as a time clock starts where a GM gets this in their hands, there's going to be variations. And as a writer, you got to know that's going to happen. Just put almost the toolbox approach, right? Put some tools in there for the GM to play with. They're going to think of things you don't even think of. And the players are going to do the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
No one knows the players better than the game master that runs the sessions with those players. I don't know them. No. I can kind of extrapolate what I think they're going to do after having a lot of years of doing stuff like this and playing my own games and being my own GM and playing within games. I'm like, I have an idea of what they'll do. But you just never know. And you got to leave enough leeway and flexibility for the game masters in there that they can feel, hey, I can breathe. It's not like you said, it's a tightly wound web, like you said, and they can't breathe in it.
Right, or if there's some kind of like fact-finding or an investigatory side where the characters have to find out things to move things forward, and there's only one way to find it out. Then you create these bottlenecks, these one-way routes that inevitably, when the players do things that the GM doesn't expect, and you, the author, who don't know any of these people, can't anticipate. I think too. I mean, I would like to hope that GMs, looking for things like this, as the GM, it's someone who isn't looking to be spoon-fed everything, but wants to, has an expectation, and a totally fair expectation, that you buy something that it provides what it says.
Yep. And I humbly hope that's the case with this. Again, I made it very reasonably priced for the amount of work that went into it, but it was more like I want to get this in folks' hands and have them enjoy it, and very humble, right? I'm sure I probably made some errors in here somewhere. There's something that's clunky that someone's going to look at, like you said, and just say, hey, that this is something I'd rewrite. And feel free. I mean, please. This is the magic of this hobby that we're in.
I think, like I said, I think it's great too that you have this is a nice bridge, because off Modiphius's website they've got a bunch of other adventures PDF adventures that they published several years ago that follow up chronologically the Quick Trip to France. Like there's Under the Gun, which I've run umpteen times, and there's Operation Falling Crystal, and there's a whole bunch of ones that take place in England, and then there's another like 2 that take place on the continent, but they are all a few months or more after A Quick Trip to France. And so I like how if if you ran it and you're like, oh yeah, that's kind of cool, my players would like to play it again, and oh, this is a good idea, here's my bridge to get them off the continent so that they can go have Under the Gun and the other ones up. Yeah, all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. Well, here's what I'll do. I will go ahead and I'll put a link to the quick start. I'll put a link to your adventure on Drive-Thru. And I encourage people, I mean, if you've done any writing for, and they actually don't call it the world builders anymore. They call it is now the Modifius world builders. 2D20 is not mentioned in it any longer. Whatever. If you've written for it, or if you've written for any other licensed property, I would really love your thoughts, your feedback. How do you go about, writing the thing for the people you'll never meet? Where do you draw the line between too much and too little when it comes to plot and when it comes to details and things like that? But very cool. I appreciate you coming on and sharing this, and look forward to talking with you more in the future.
Thanks, Jeremy.
All right, man. Have a great day.
Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can join our Discord, you can subscribe to the podcast, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes. Thanks again. Have a great day. We look forward to talking with you.